I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the play on earlier streets, but this I think is because it's a pretty good flop for your opponent to continuation bet. And if you don't understand what I mean by that, I'd recommend watching the first series that I did for Poker Savvy, which has to do with flop play and looking at flop texture. But because this is a good board for your opponent to continuation bet, I think it's a decent time to make a bluff raise occasionally. So that's what we go for here. We try to bluff raise, opponent calls. He checks and we check also after turning an open-ended straight draw. It's certainly not a guarantee that you'd have to check here. Something you want to realize, though, is that right now your hand looks a lot like either you have nothing, like he probably thinks that you were raising as a bluff, or maybe it looks like you have a flush draw, so you raised the flop and then you missed on the turn and you decided you're going to take a free river. Now, in fact, we do have a draw, but it's not the draw that our opponent expects us to have. So the draw gets there, he checks again. Now let's think about what hands he could possibly have. It seems pretty unlikely he has a monster, given that he bet once, but then he just called a raise, and now he's checked twice. So he's passed up 3 opportunities for aggression. This is a reasonable board for him to slow play if he did have a monster. So it's not impossible, but it seems pretty unlikely that he has a monster based on the fact that he's checked 3 times. If he had a draw, it wouldn't have been unreasonable for him to get it in on the flop, because especially if he's aware of the fact that this is a good board for us to bluff raise, it's a pretty good time for him to come back over the top with a draw also. So if he had something like spades, even if he didn't have a big draw, even if he didn't have like a flush draw with an overcard, like the nut flush draw, I could still see him 3-betting with any flush draw on this flop, just because it seems like our flop raise is going to be a bluff very often. So I'm not expecting draws to be a big part of his range either. And I also think because it looks like we don't have very much, we raise the flop, but then we just check the turn. I wouldn't be surprised if he bluffed the river if he did have a spade draw, rather than just giving up here. And there aren't that many draws to have. I mean, if he called the flop, so he's got to have either some showdown value or a draw. There's really only one draw he could have. I'm not sure he would have played a draw like this anyway. So I think his line is going to be a hand that's looking to showdown more often than anything. Now, since we're not expecting him to have a monster, you might be inclined to say, look, I can't bet that much. Why am I going to make a pot-sized bet when I just said I don't think this guy has a monster? He probably doesn't even have, I mean, maybe he has like a king with a kind of a weak kicker, like king-jack, or maybe he has like 8-7, just not expecting him to have that big of a hand. So why am I betting this much? Well, remember what I said our hand looked like. It looked like we had not very much. We raised the flop, he called, and then we chose not to bet the turn. I think our opponent is not expecting us to show up with a monster hand here at all.